In this lesson, we'll talk about some viewport shading methods in Maya, as well as some selection techniques that we need to be aware of. Okay, so for this lesson, we're actually going to start with a scene file that we've provided for you. So let's go up to Open, and if you take a look inside the Introduction to Maya 13 Scenes directory, let's go up to 06 Begin. So this is going to be Lesson 6. We're going to open up the start file for that. Okay, so we have this simple little scene here. Now, up to this point, we've been looking at objects in the viewport in this simple wireframe mode. Now, this is going to be the default shading method in Maya, and to switch between this wireframe and some other shading methods, we're going to need to remember a few simple keyboard shortcuts. So this is primarily going to be done on the number keys on your keyboard. So the 4 key is going to be the keyboard shortcut to switch to this wireframe view. Next to that, we have the 5 key on your keyboard, which is going to switch us to this shaded mode. So now we actually have some kind of shading that's going on here in the viewport, and you can see we do have these 2 different object types, and we'll talk a little bit more about these 2 different surface types as we start to get into our next lesson, and you'll really start to get familiar with these as we start to get into the modeling section of this training. So again, the 5 key is our simple shading mode. Next to that, we have the 6 key. Now the 6 key will let us see any textures that we have applied to our surfaces, and again, you'll learn a little bit more about textures as you start to get into the texturing section of this training. And next to that, we have the 7 key on our keyboard. Now the 7 key allows us to see any lighting that we have set up. So if I pull my camera back, you can see I have a couple of simple light sources here. And if I were to switch to something like my Move tool, I could grab the Move tool and then grab my lights and move those around. And again, if I have the 7 key pressed on my keyboard, I can see what that lighting looks like. Now, the results that we get here in this lighted view can really kind of be dependent on the keyboard shortcut that we used previously. So if I press 5, then 7, you can see we have a lighted view, but with no textures, just a simple shading. Now if I press 6, followed by 7, now we again have a lighted view, but now we can also see textures in the viewport as well. If you press the 8 key on your keyboard, that takes you into a Paint Effects drawing mode. Now typically you won't want to be in this mode, so if you find yourself in this mode accidentally and need to get out of it, just simply press the 8 key again. You can see that still leaves us in this Paint Effects drawing mode, so just switch to something like your Select tool, and there we go. Again, press 4, 5, 6, and 7. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the process of making selections in Maya. Now there's a couple of different techniques that we have available to us. One is to simply click on your object to select. Now we also have the ability to sort of do a marquee select. So if you click and drag to select something, you can select an object that way. Now there's pros and cons to both methods. Number one, with this simple clicking method, it's a little bit more precise. You don't have to worry about accidentally selecting things that you don't want to. With this marquee select, I've known a lot of people who really kind of tend to use this as their default selection method, and it's really not a great habit to get into because you can accidentally wind up selecting things that you don't want. Anytime you do a marquee select, Maya will select anything that falls inside of that marquee, whether it's behind or in front of the object that you're actually trying to select. It'll grab everything in this area, which we can see here. Now, this starts to become a little bit problematic, especially when we have multiple objects in our scene. So, for example, if I wanted to grab this NURBS sphere right in front of me. Now, at the moment, you can see I have this polygon object behind here. So if I'm trying to grab this NURBS sphere, and if I do a marquee select, just clicking and dragging, you can see, yes, I do have this sphere selected. But the problem is, I also have this guy back here selected as well, and I don't necessarily want that. Now, there's a couple of indicators here that you can look at in Maya to tell whether or not you have multiple objects selected. Usually, if you just have one object selected, you'll see this simple little green wireframe around your objects. Now, if I marquee select, you'll notice that it's no longer a green wireframe, it's now sort of this white wireframe. So anytime you have multiple objects selected, you'll usually have a green wireframe and a white one. So the green wireframe usually indicates the last object that was selected, Another indicator that you have multiple objects selected is up here in your channel box, which we'll talk about this channel box area a little bit later in this training. But for now, what I want you to look at is this area right up here. If I just simply click on an object, normally this is the area where the name of that object gets displayed, so we can see exactly what it is that we have selected. You can see if I have just one object selected, one name shows up here. Now, watch what happens if I do a marquee select. You can see number one, this wireframe changes to white, which is, again, a pretty good indicator that I have multiple objects selected. But the other indicator that we have here is the fact that we have an object name followed by 3 little dots. Anytime we have those 3 little dots, that's an indicator that we have more than one object selected, or we have this object selected plus several others. So let's talk a little bit about selections and how we can start to control the selections in Maya. So what we can do is, if we need to have multiple objects selected, again, we've seen how we can do a marquee select to grab multiple objects, but we can also do selections with a little bit more control with just a simple select. Now, if I press and hold the Shift key on my keyboard, I can start to add more selections or more objects to this selection. The Shift key, whenever selecting objects, really sort of acts like a toggle. So if I Shift select an object, I can add it to my selection, or I can also continue to hold Shift and toggle that selection on or off. So this becomes, again, sort of a useful thing if we have, let's say, multiple objects selected. If I press and hold Shift and click and drag, you can see it, again, just sort of toggles the objects that are selected. So the objects that were selected are no longer part of my selection, and vice versa. Now, if I press the Control key on my keyboard, Control key acts as a pure deselection mode. So you can see as long as I press and hold the Control key, it's only going to serve to remove objects from my selection. Now if I press Control and Shift at the same time, this is used purely for adding to selections. So you can see if I press and hold Control and Shift at the same time and try to make my selections, it will only add. Okay, so these selection methods, as well as these different shading methods that we've looked at, are going to start to become really, really important as you start to use Maya on your own and start to move further through some of the later lessons in this course. Okay, so that's a look at how we can start to control the shading of our viewports, as well as controlling object selection methods inside of Maya.